Alright, I'm David Harry, and in this video I'm going to give you a very practical, if somewhat boring, explanation as to what the differences are between 8-bit video and 10-bit video. Now, for the best part of this video, I will be using DaVinci Resolve to kind of show stuff and to explain things. Now, part of what I will be doing here will consist of 6 video files. Now, those video files are available to download from a link in the video description below. However, I would strongly recommend that before you start playing with those files, you listen to as much of this video as possible in order to understand what those files are and how they may be of use to you. Also, it's probably worth noting that the combined file size for all 6 files is only about 5.2 megabytes, so really small and dead easy to download. Now, just a few other things before I carry on. I am very likely to use the words color and shade interchangeably. And the reason for that is because realistically they are one of the same. So as a for instance, if you have got 2 completely unique shades of, say, blue for instance, in essence they then become 2 different colors. And the other reason why I'm going to use those 2 words interchangeably is because I have absolutely no consistency whatsoever, because I don't script anything. And there is actually another point that I'm going to be making in this video, and that is to dispel the common misconception on YouTube that uploading 10-bit files is better than 8-bit, because it absolutely is not. And that is something that I will categorically prove and show within this video as well. So I will be referencing to YouTube quite a lot as I do this, and the main reason why is because you're watching this video on YouTube, and that will impact massively on what I'm about to show you. Also, the last thing to bleat on about here before I kick into this, and that is this video is all about standard dynamic range video and how that relates to YouTube as well. I mean, there are unique differences between HDR and SDR and the way YouTube handles that, and of course obviously HDR has to be 10-bit as a minimum anyways, but like I just said, this video is going to be all about standard dynamic range video, or to be more technically precise, Rec 709, and how that actually interacts, or the way it's dealt with by YouTube once videos are uploaded. Okay, so to start off with then, what do we mean by 8-bit and 10-bit? Or maybe more precisely, what do we mean by bit and bits? Well, in traditional binary computing, the bit is our basic unit for measurement of numbers, or storage of numbers, or representing of numbers. So a single bit represents either off or on, or 0 or 1. And when you start combining more bits, that then gives you the ability to represent more and more numbers. So in the terms of when we're talking about video and 8-bit and 10-bit, those bits just allow us to represent more colors as opposed to just the pure numbers. So what that basically means is when we're using 8-bit, that allows us to select any number up to 256, and when we're using 10-bit, that allows us to select any number up to 1024. So when we apply those bits and numbers to our primary colors within a video signal, which are red, green and blue, that means that each color, red, green and blue, can have a single value assigned to each one, up to 256. So essentially what that means is for each of those primary colors, we can have one of 256 shades represented by an 8-bit number. Now, whilst 256 might seem a little bit limiting, when we start combining those 256s together, that essentially gives us a much wider color palette, which is able to represent up to 16,777,216 colors. Now, for the purposes of this video, I'll just refer to 8-bit as being millions of colors. However, when we switch over to 10-bit and we've got 1024 variants within each of the color channels, that then allows us to have an overall color palette which can consist of 1,073,741,824 unique shades or colors. And yes, I have just had to read that off one of my notes because there's no way I'm remembering those big numbers. But nonetheless, as we can see there, the basics of 8-bit means that each of the color channels can have one of 256 numbers applied to it, which ends up being a shade of that particular color. And then when we're talking about 10-bit, each of the colors, red, green and blue, then extends up to one of 1,024 colors. So immediately there, we can definitely see that 10-bit has got an advantage because it allows us overall to represent many more different shades of color, not just uniquely within inside each of the primary colors, but in our overall color palette. Okay, so with that super boring stuff out of the way with, it is now time to get on to the very exciting boring stuff. And immediately what we're going to see here is the point that I said earlier about the fact that there is absolutely no difference between uploading 10-bit and 8-bit video to YouTube from the same source when we're dealing with SDR. So what it is on the screen, unfortunately, you are always going to see what I'm doing represented as 8-bit and obviously the color banding associated with that. However, I will get to those examples that I've been talking about and I will explain what they are, and then when you download them, you will definitely see the differences. Anyway, so to start off with, what I've got as my first asset here in the timeline, this is basically just a color which is being generated by Resolve, or more precisely, it's a gradient of color. And the reason why it's a gradient is because this will allow us to basically check to see what the difference is as far as banding is concerned, which is essentially the thing that we will notice as the difference between 8-bit and 10-bit. But unfortunately, right now, what you're seeing on the screen is a bunch of banding in that blue on the preview window. However, what I'm seeing, because I'm viewing it back in 10-bit, is actually just a nice kind of like, unbanded gradient across the screen, and it looks really nice. Anyway, so like I say, this here is going to be the starting block, this first asset, and everything else is generated from that. So the second asset that I've got here is a 10-bit uncompressed output, which was like come from that first asset. Now, if I just come up to the file manager up here, as we can see, this thing that I've got selected is YUV422 10-bit, okay? Now, this next asset here is the exact same thing generated from the first asset, but this one, as we can see, is YUV422 8-bit. Now, just quickly, there is obviously things going on here to do with chroma subsampling. However, that will not affect absolutely anything as far as this particular exercise and example is concerned. If this video kind of does anything, and if people are into it, I'll also do a similar boring video about chroma subsampling as well. Anyways, so like I say, we've got the original asset here. We've then got a 10-bit duplicate of it, or a 10-bit render of it, which is in 422, and then we've got an 8-bit render of it, which is also in 422. Once again, the chroma subsampling doesn't come into effect here. It's just that these were the only options for doing the masters. Now, what I'm going to do is do things between these masters as far as the outputs are concerned, but immediately what I'm going to show you is this. So if I look at the 10-bit master here, what I'm seeing here is just a nice smooth gradient within that preview window, once again because I am looking at it on a 10-bit panel. However, when I come over to this one here, I can now see unique banding within it because this is now 8-bit. But if I just go between these two things, you are basically going to see the exact same thing, which are two things which both look like they've got banding on them. Now, let me just try and do this a bit better for you, actually. So what I'm going to do is just go full screen here. So right now, that's the 8-bit file. And right now, that's the 10-bit file. So 8-bit, 10-bit, 8-bit, 10-bit. Now, like I said, unfortunately, you will have seen those two things look basically identical. Now, there might be slight differences on that playback there, and that will only be where the banding might occur or change, because what's going on here is that YouTube is truncating the 10-bit file to 8. Now, in doing so, it is just going to basically select the areas where it applies the truncation. So the banding might move a little bit, but nonetheless, it is definitely still there after YouTube has done its thing. Okay, now what I'm going to do is to explain how I've prepared my outputs. So if I just open this up a bit here, what I've done here is to have gotten variations of like dead simple comps and whatnot and split screens, which are derived from these two files here. So as a for instance, the first one there, as we'll be able to see there, it says 10-bit, which is the reference to its input. And then the output here says 10-bit output. Once again, that's its reference to the output. Now, of course, I can see something which has just got a very smooth gradient running through it here, but you won't. You will be seeing something with a lot of stepping and banding in it. Now, the next file along the line here, this says 10-bit input and 8-bit output. And the reason why I've done this one is because on those output files, you can test for yourself that when you go from 10-bit to 8-bit, obviously you introduce the banding at that point. And then if you look back at the 10-bit in, 10-bit out file, you will see that the banding isn't there. Once again, just showing you again that no matter where you put any 10-bit file to, if it's going to be compressing it down to 8-bit, such as YouTube, you will have banding introduced, and it will be the exact same type of banding that you would have got on an original 8-bit file. And to prove that, the next file here says 8-bit input and 10-bit output. Now at this point here, although the output has been done in 10-bit, the input was only 8-bit. So what's happening here? We are padding out the bits. So we're not going to get any more extra kind of definition within the color range. We're just basically taking that banded 8-bit video and sticking it inside 10 bits, and it will still remain the same as having the banding in it. And you will definitely see that on the screen, and you'll also see that in the example on the output as well. And just to clarify the difference or the lack of differences here, the next one here is 8-bit on the input and 8-bit on the output. Now, if I just go full screen with this as a for instance, if I just flip backwards and forwards between those two, you're going to effectively see the exact same thing as I'm flipping backwards and forwards between them. So there you go, exactly the same. The banding may shift somewhere, but it's definitely going to be banding. In fact, let me just go back to these 10-bit examples here and I'll do the same. So I'll just go full screen here. So there is the 8-bit output for the 10-bit input. And then there's the 10-bit output for the 10-bit input. Now, although they are uniquely different, you are going to see them exactly the same because once again, YouTube is truncating anything that's 10-bit down to 8-bit. Now, let me come out of there. Now, if I come to the last two examples here, what these are split screens between the 10-bit input and the 8-bit input being combined into either a 10-bit output or an 8-bit output. So this first one is the split screen in 10-bit. Now, if I just go full screen here, what you are going to see is banding right across the whole screen there. However, when I'm looking at it, because I'm looking at it in 10-bit, I can see a definite line in the middle of the screen where the 10-bit side is all nice and smooth. And then on the right-hand side, which is 8-bit, that has got the banding in it. Now, if I just come out of there and go to the last example, this is the same thing again, the split screen between 10-bit and 8-bit. And I've got now the 8-bit output. Now, again, the thing is here, what's going to happen when you see the final output files, these are going to be banded right the way through. So if I just show you this in full screen, what you're going to see there is banding right the way through. And that is absolutely correct because the 10-bit file will have been truncated to 8-bit. So both sides will essentially look identical. Like I say, the banding may have shifted into slightly different positions, but the banding is there nonetheless. Okay, now if I come to these files here, let me just bring this up. What these files are the outputs here from these files. So all these comps here have all been individually outputted to these 6 files. Now I'm wondering if I can see what these are within the inspector. So if I go to the first file here, as we can see, that's the 10-bit in, 10-bit out. Now this is going to just give us things like main 10, level 6.1 and stuff. Those characteristics there do actually relate to the differences between 8-bit and 10-bit, because if I come down to the last one here, which is a 10-bit output, as we can see, this goes main level 6.1. Then if I go back to this one, this is main 10 level 6.1. So anything with the 10 in it just means that it's 10-bit. So I'll just carry on flipping through here. So this next one is 8-bit. As we can see, there's no 10 in it. The next one here is 10-bit. And then the next one is 8-bit, then the next one is 10-bit, and then the next one is 8-bit. Now what I'm going to do here is just to play through all 6 of these files one after each other. They're only 5 seconds long each, so it's not going to be mad long or anything. But don't forget, as they go through, what it is, the top up here tells us what the actual input was, and then down here tells us what the output was. And then obviously when we get down to the splits down here, this tells us that either side of the split is a particular bit depth, and then it relates then to the output there. So I'm just going to go full screen. Now before I click on play here, what I'm going to tell you right now is that all these are going to look exactly the same to you, regardless of whether it is 10-bit on its own with a 10-bit output, and regardless of whether it's like an 8-bit split and an 8-bit output. So here we go. Okay, so now having run through those 6 files, what will have happened there is that on playback on YouTube for you, everything would have just looked like it had banding in it. On top of that as well, we may also have particular artifacts going on due to the compression being like a really low bit rate on the YouTube output as well. So we do have that to contend with. However, you know, the actual source files which you can download won't suffer that. But nonetheless, everything you will have just seen there will all have had banding on, regardless of, like, you know, what its bit depth was to start off with, and regardless of what its bit depth was on the output. It will all have been equalized out by what YouTube has done to it. And then once again, that just proves the point that there is absolutely no difference between uploading 10-bit versus 8-bit to YouTube from the exact same source files and what have you. Now there is something that I just want to explain quickly here as well. With these files that you can download, what they're also going to be useful for you is to be able to check as to whether or not you are definitely playing back in 10-bit or being able to view in 10-bit. So as a for instance, let's just say you've got, say, a computer plugged to a particular monitor and that's meant to be 10-bit. If you play the 10-bit variants of these files, you should definitely see something that does not have banding on it. So these files might be useful for you just to make sure that your setup is actually playing out properly as far as the bit depth is concerned. And also, you might be using media players connected to a TV or something like that, and maybe you might be unsure as to whether or not, you know, something might be getting lost within the settings or the setup of that type of playback system. Once again, these particular files will also help you to kind of see those those differences as well. And if, for instance, you're seeing the 10-bit files playing back with banding in, then you definitely know that somewhere along the line everything is being converted to 8-bit. So it's going to help people to kind of, ascertain as to whether or not their kind of signal path is being compromised in some way or another. Okay, so that should just about do it then for this super long, boring video. So what I'm going to do is try and wrap this up pretty quick now. Now, the first thing that I've got to say here is there's a reason why this video has been the length that it's been, and that's because you can't really skate over a bunch of the stuff with videos like this. They have to be explained thoroughly and with examples, and obviously that is exactly what I've done. And the other point to this video being so long as well is just so that people do understand that regardless of what you may have seen around the internet or on YouTube to do with 10-bit and 8-bit video, and especially to do with uploading those types of videos to YouTube, there is absolutely no difference in these things. I would say that your biggest difference, or what's going to make the biggest difference for your uploads, is to use a really good codec and to also kind of like use the highest bit rate that you can. Once you go beyond a certain bit rate and stuff like that, it's very massive diminishing returns and what have you. If there's people interested in that type of stuff, and if a lot of people watch this video, I'll do stuff to do with bit rate and things like that. And like I said at the beginning of the video as well, we also have things to do with chroma subsampling, which also don't affect really anything on YouTube either. So again, if there's enough people into this type of stuff, I'll do something a bit more in depth on chroma subsampling as well. Anywho, definitely download these files and have a play with them for yourself, and hopefully they will be of some use to you. And if you've liked the video, please give it a massive thumbs up, and a sub to the channel would be awesome. I'm David Harry. Thank you very much for watching this long and excruciatingly boring video. Take care and goodbye now.